welcome everyone. As I think you all know, today is a dissertation defense, and Steve Williamson will be defending the work that he's been doing for quite some time. And he will follow the usual protocol for dissertation and thesis defenses, where the candidate will present their work. There'll be kind of public questioning. Then all but the exam committee and the candidate will be dismissed, and the exam committee will ask a few more questions, whatever they would like, and then the candidate is dismissed, and the committee will render their final verdict on successful or unsuccessful defense. Anyways, and actually, before I start with Steve, I just want to remind everyone that this is a pretty packed week, but everyone is encouraged to come to all the presentations. Patty Yao will be defending her dissertation tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And then at noon, we have an outside speaker. I know it's a lot for one day, but he's passing through town, a colleague of mine, Dr. Steve Lapkoff, who has done a lot of work in informatics in the pharmaceutical industry, and I think most people will find his talk interesting. He works for Intelligent Medical Objects now, which is a terminology company. Anyway, so I hope to see everyone at both those talks tomorrow. So back to Steve. This is his fifth year as a PhD student. He has been a fixture around the department, been on the NLM training grant. He came to us after receiving his bachelor's degree in computer information technology from Brigham Young University, Idaho, and he's focused his graduate work on mobile applications in consumer health, and he's going to present to us today on working with family caregivers of older adults. So, all yours.
All right. Bill? Thanks everyone for being here. It's this is a big day for me, and I appreciate you all being here. So everything that I'm going to talk to you today about is about people, and I really like that about my work. It's about how do we help people and how do we understand people. And I've titled this "The User-Centered Design of Mobile Apps for Distance Caregivers of Older Adults That Live in a Smart Home Environment." And I wanted to kind of start by taking a step back. Back a long time ago, this is to about 400 BC, the Confucian philosophy of filial piety. What does that mean? It means respecting one's elders. And that was depicted way back then. And this idea of how do we care for our older adults in our society is nothing new, but the challenges that come with that are changing. So, one way you can look at this is through use of what they call population pyramids, this idea that you can get a bar graph, this is male and female, of the population distribution over the different age groups. And back in 1980, you can see we have somewhat of a pyramid shape with an extra sort of boom right here that you can see. Well, let's see what happens over time. So in 2010, about right now, we have more of this squaring kind of shape. But when we look at the projection for 2040, especially look at what happens in these age groups right here, that there's this almost doubling in a lot of, if you go back and forth between those two age groups. And this is called population aging, and it's something that's not just here in the United States. In fact, in many other countries, it's even more obvious that it's going to happen and is happening. And so what does that mean in healthcare? Well, on this side, we have the number of enrollees in Medicare, the largest way that people receive medical care as they age. And we see that there's going to be almost a doubling in the number of people that enroll in Medicare. And then even more significantly, the difference in cost per person is also going to close to double. And so, how do we minimize some of this increase? Because we have kind of the double effect here of increased enrollees and increased cost. Part of the problem is, this is an article that popped up on CNN just a couple days ago, really, in May. And this idea of elder orphans, that more and more older adults, through various circumstances, whether it's that their children don't live close by, maybe they never had children, their children have died, for whatever reason, they are orphans as older adults. And they said that approximately, because 1/3 of Americans in the younger categories are single, that we're really going to have an increased problem with this idea of older adult orphans as well. And we don't have enough care facilities to take care of all of these people. And the research agrees, with the common media, which, happens every once in a while. And, so Ryan et al., projected this a few years ago as well, that we're going to have more and more people that don't live with a spouse or don't live with a child nearby. Look at these huge increases in just 20 years, especially over here. And so the problem is, let's review. Number one, we have more older adults in general. Number two, it's going to cost more to take care of these people. That's coming. And number three, we have fewer family members to take care of these people. And so how can informatics play a role in this? How can we come in? Well, one way we can do this is through looking at family caregivers. Family caregivers are friends and family members that provide unpaid care to older adults. And there's about 34 million caregivers throughout the United States. And on average, they provide about 20 hours of care. I love this number. If we paid them all $10 an hour, we'd have to give them almost $500 billion every single year, which is, that's significant. That's 15% of all the money we spend on healthcare every year. We would have to pay just to them. And so the IOM, the Institute of Medicine, called it the backbone of much of the care that's received in the United States is provided by these caregivers. So in informatics, we love to use technology and we love people. And so the whole idea is, the central theorem of our whole field is that a person plus a computing device is better than just a person by themselves. That there's some sort of augmentation that happens through combining technology with people. And often we talk about that in the case of a physician, but today we're going to talk about that in the case of a caregiver. How can we augment caregivers and help them to provide better care? And we went to the research, and honestly, there's not a lot of information about how to do this. And so that was where we started our search. One way you could do this, though, is through there's been a recent explosion of what they call smart homes. And these homes have different sort of sensors where we can look at things like socialization, medication, vital signs, cognition, blood glucose levels, goals, activities, and sleep. And we have all these different sensors that can measure all these sorts of different things for the older adult, and then possibly feed that information back to a caregiver. And there's been some effort to do that. I'll let you guess which one is industry and which one is academia. And we kind of have this interesting juxtaposition where on the industry side, there's some good design going on, but there's no real research to back up the validity and the effectiveness of these tools. On the research side, we are seeing more of that work, but there's very little design work that's taking place. One thing we really did find in the research so far, though, is a lot of questions. And, there's a whole bunch of different ones I pulled out here. And you don't have to read every single one, but I think the important part here is, number one, the things that are highlighted in color here. Those are kind of the types of information and the questions we're going to ask. But also, like I said, this talk is about people. And every single one of these questions involves caregivers in one way or another. And so to answer these questions, we need to understand this group more specifically and more deeply. And I really like this quote. We have academia and we have industry. And this idea that good design is really a combination of science and art. That's where they break even. And that we really can apply science to design and find this kind of good match between the left and right brain. So one way we can do that is through something called user-centered design. And I really like this quote, that user-centered design means understanding what your users need, how they think, and how they behave, and then incorporating that understanding into every aspect of your process. And these three words that I have highlighted here, those are going to kind of be our guiding principles as we go through and talk about the different work that I've done. And we'll see here that, the first study, we looked at users' needs, and we did a needs assessment, where we were able to go through and talk to caregivers and have open discussions with them about what were their needs. The second phase was we wanted to understand how people behaved, and one way to do that was through usability research, where we could provide them with a tool and see how they interacted with it and how they behaved. And then finally, within that tool, we really wanted to understand how that tool caused them to think and how they were able to understand that tool. And this idea that we can understand the insight that they can gain from charts and figures within a tool. So let's dive right in. We'll kind of go through each of these steps. The first step, we really want to understand caregiver needs. And we started with, the things here. We talked to people, we talked to experts, we looked in the research, we looked at what had been done commercially, and we fed that all into an interview process that then helped us to understand caregiver needs. And here at OHSU, we're very lucky. We have access to what we call the Architect Living Lab, which is a group of older adults that live in their own homes, and they live in these smart homes that I was talking about. And they are able to live independently, and then we monitor them. And we use this as kind of a test platform to look at different technologies to promote healthy aging. And so we measure things like their sleep, how we provide them with cognitive exercises, how much social interaction are they getting, are they physically active. And one of those interventions, the socialization intervention, required them to talk with one of their family members on a regular basis. And so we were able to use these family members that we already had recruited and then bring them into our needs assessment study. And so we were able to talk to 10 of them, and since they were all over America, we used Skype to do that. We Skyped with them, and then we used what we called stimulus materials, this idea that we provided them with prototypes and mock-ups to help elicit more feedback. But first of all, we asked them these very basic questions. What information would help you care for your older adult remotely? And then how could a computer tool or a website help you? And we just let them talk, and we listened, and we recorded what they said. And we really tried to just open-endedly allow them to provide information, what would be useful to them. At that point, we then, I like this quote, you have to feed forward if you want feedback. And so we fed it forward by providing some stimulus materials and through providing them with some sort of a mock-up. And it was something like this we presented over PowerPoint, over Skype, and just some basic semi-interactive screenshots, and then we're able to get their feedback and elicit even further discussion and results from them. So like I said, we recorded them, then we transcribed and coded them, and then sort of tried to categorize and make sense of it all. So what are some of the information needs that they talked about? Well, there's a lot of them, and I don't want to talk about all of them because I don't have enough time, but a few of them that were important. Number one, this idea of a shared calendar between the older adult and the caregiver, and maybe even multiple caregivers, and this idea that we can collaborate and coordinate care through the use of a calendar. Everybody I talked to talked about the importance of medication, and they really wanted to be able to understand if pill boxes were properly filled, and if older adults were adhering to the medication regimen that had been prescribed to them. People really were interested in cognitive health. I think there's a lot of fear about cognitive decline in older age, and so caregivers really wanted to be able to understand that more deeply. And they really wanted to be able to track it over time as well, this idea that it's really important to track that kind of information longitudinally instead of just having small snapshots. And then, of course, they wanted intelligent alerts that if there was a problem, they wanted to be told there was a problem. They didn't want to always have to be checking a tool and go in and always find out, but they wanted to have an alert when it was necessary. And then they also, this idea of how can I help my loved one, they wanted some feedback and guidance. They wanted to know if they were doing well. They wanted to know what they could change, that sort of thing. So those are the information needs, but we also came up with some design needs that go along with that. We talked to them about how they would use some sort of a tool. How often would they use it, that sort of thing. And a lot of people said they would use it, half of the people said they would use it more than once a week, with quite a few people using it multiple times a week. And they talked about this sort of in and out usage, where it was a quick in, quick out. And so, how can we design a tool to fit that usage pattern? Well, it needs to be informative, it needs to be understandable, some sort of a dashboard perhaps. It needs to be really easy to understand. And they really talked about how if you're going to alert me, it better be a real deal. It better not just be a small little change or something. It better be important. And so we need to be conservative about that. Some of the other things, we'd ask them, what sort of device would you use? Well, they said, when I'm on the go, I'll use a smartphone, I'll use an iPad. But when I come back home, I want to be able to use it on my computer as well. And so this idea, I like this picture, this idea that we can use an application, a program, on multiple different devices, and it behaves similarly across devices. And we can kind of hybridize where the application lives, and it's less important about which device it's on. And then one other thing we found too is that most people on their smartphones already had a calendar, so they didn't want another one. And this idea that we shouldn't reproduce things that people already have, which seems obvious, but we do it all the time if you look at a lot of the other things that are done. And the final thing here, this idea that older adults, or the caregivers felt that the older adults would really want to have control over who saw the data and be able to turn it off. And to caregivers, that was an important feature, even though it wasn't their data. This idea that when we do provide longitudinal data, we really need to find a way to mitigate noise was something that they talked about. And they wanted to be able to provide personalized thresholds for older adults, depending on the condition and their health concerns at the time. And then this one was interesting too, this idea that most of the people we talked to didn't identify as caregivers themselves. They said, oh, a caregiver is someone who provides hands-on care. And so we had to think, how does that influence our design? That we can't necessarily refer to these people as caregivers when we're talking to them, because they might think that's somebody else instead of themselves. So, this was our needs assessment, and this is how we started to understand needs. And, what are some of the criticisms? Well, we talked to 10 people, so, that is a fairly small sample. And people knew that I was directly tied to this work, and because of that, often people may be hesitant to criticize. And then, in the words of Steve Jobs, people don't necessarily know what they need. And, that's a definite consideration when we think about our findings from this work. So that's the first study. So we took these needs and we built a prototype. We built a fully interactive prototype this time. And then we were able to go into usability testing, where we were able to let caregivers actually use the tool. And then after we analyzed the results, then those findings we fed back into our prototype, and we do iterative testing over multiple cycles to improve the usability of our prototype. And so we're going to go through each of those stages. What did the interactive prototype look like? Well, something like this. This was, one of the graph screens, and this is kind of the home screen for the application. And after we built that in a tool called Just in Mind, which is a prototype builder that uses HTML and JavaScript. And we then went into usability testing, where we're able to actually start to see how people interact with this. And so we had 5 different scenarios that were based on, the most typical tasks and activities that we thought people would do within the app. And we asked them to follow these tasks and then to think aloud. And the idea is, you just say what you're thinking as you go. But more importantly than what they said, we were concerned with what they were doing. And so a lot of observation went into this as well. And then finally, at the end, after usability testing, then we had debriefing interviews where we were able to ask them why they did things. What was going through your head when you did this or did that? And then to analyze, we developed a fairly novel approach to actually analyzing the results. So we went through and we actually listed each of the problems that we found, and then we threw them into 3 separate categories. And the whole idea here is we were trying to be very operational, very quick. And so we either said, well, number 1, we don't understand this well enough, and we need to keep going in the next round of testing to better understand this issue. Or we came up with a solution. And then in the next round, if we had implemented a solution, we then tried to see if we had actually fixed that specific problem. And so, you can see some of the different issues here and how we were able to resolve them over multiple rounds of testing and design. And then, like I said, we fed that information back into the prototype and improved it over time. So, why do you do this? Why do you do multiple rounds? And why not just do testing with 15 or 20 people in one round? Well, this is based on the work of Williamson, which, if you look over here, as you increase the number of people in your test, you find out less and less information per person. And so if you look right at about 5 users, you find out about 80% of the usability problems from the first 5 users in your test. And so, the idea here is you find out most problems, and then you fix those, and then you're able to kind of take care of the low-hanging fruit first. And so we did that by, number 1, our first round, we used usability students. So basically it was people here in the department, and people that had taken some classes in usability, and were able to find a lot of the issues that were in the application. And the reason we did that was because we wanted to have the most authentic version of the prototype for our most authentic test subjects. And so we're able to do that across the 3 different rounds and keep this kind of operational, rapid approach throughout the whole thing. So, what did we find out? Well, if you look at the total number of problems for each round, and then the newly identified problems for each round, you see that some issues came up here that were also in this round. And the point is, though, that over time, the number of issues goes down, and especially the number of new issues goes down significantly. So what were some of the issues? Well, there was a lot of kind of app-specific tweaks that we talk about. So, for example, this was a legend for a graph, and to be able to see the different colors in the graph, you had to be able to discern through these between these 3 different colors. And they really said, well, that needs to be bigger, so we changed them to squares, just basic things. Over here, if you look on your smartphone, there's often a little circle with some sort of a badge or notification. But you probably haven't seen one of these before, where there's a check mark saying there's everything that's okay, because the way that's communicated is generally through the absence of any sort of a badge. And so people told us that we need to, that's actually confusing to tell us it's okay. We'd rather see nothing there. A third one was people wanted to click on the word Zoom rather than realize it was just a label. And they also were confused by these abbreviations. This idea, 1M to them meant 1 minute when we were going for 1 month. And then the height of the buttons we changed to. Just a lot of very small but significant things that we wouldn't have realized if we hadn't gone through this process. What are some kind of larger scale things that we learned, though? Well, one thing, this idea of data stacking. So if you look right here, a lot of people in our study said, okay, the number of outgoing minutes is, what is that, about 45 maybe? When you actually look at the little legend that pops up, though, it was actually 37. And the idea here is that these 2 series are actually meant to be stacked on top of each other. And that was really confusing to a lot of people. Interestingly, though, if you do that with a bar graph, people were able to understand it without any problems. And so, one of the things we really learned from this is the importance of not stacking axes like this, or stacking different series of data in some sort of a line graph, but that it is appropriate as a bar graph. The other thing that really came out was the difficulty of conveying images of medications. And so the idea here, if you see version 1, is that this is an image of the pill box at the day before or early in the day. So, yesterday, and then today this pill box is empty. And the user's task is then to say, well, if I look up here, yesterday there were pills, and then today there are not pills, which for one day is appropriate, but then these other 2 compartments shouldn't be empty. And so people had a really hard time comparing the top to the bottom image. So we added, in version 2, we tried adding this kind of yellow box to focus people's attention. It still didn't work. And then in version 3, we tried something completely different, where we separated out images for each and every day. And it still didn't work. And in version 4, honestly, this is the design we're at right now. But the problem is we only had 3 rounds of usability testing. And we still don't know if it works. But we have some data from previous rounds that suggest that it might. And so, one of the important take-homes from this is that rather than thinking about usability testing as, okay, I need to do 3 rounds, we really need to think about it as we need to do 2 additional rounds after any significant redesign, which I think is a more intelligent way of thinking about it rather than just the generic 3 times. So what are some of the limitations of this? Well, a third of our subjects were caregivers, but that's also a strength in a way because it allowed us to be more nimble in the way we conducted our testing. Same thing goes for the fact that we didn't do any audio or video recording. We could have done that, and it probably would have added to the scientific rigor, but it also would have been a much slower, cumbersome process. And we really wanted to be more agile than that. This was done in the lab setting, and then there are multiple papers that are documenting this idea of an evaluator effect, that when you are doing think aloud usability testing, it's highly dependent on the skills of the researcher doing the work. So we had this mobile app, and we had a prototype, but we still didn't really understand what we were communicating to people. We presented them with charts and figures. We knew that they could kind of navigate through them, but we didn't understand if they were actually able to discern if there was a problem and actually understand some of what was going on. So this was the progression from start to finish from the usability testing. And so it's this idea that the tool was usable, but it's not necessarily insightful. And so how can we look at the insight that is communicated, and how can we measure the value of the different charts and figures within the app? And so to do this, there's a couple different ways to do this. And so one way to do this is through what they call benchmark-based evaluation, where basically you present a chart and figure, something like this, and then you ask a question. So which hamburger topping is preferred by the most NLM fellows? And if you answer lettuce, then great, you get a prize, and otherwise you fail. But basically looking at what's the rate of correct versus incorrect when you ask a question about a visualization. But there's some problems with doing it this way. Number one, it requires very specific questions that have very specific answers. The second part of this is that it's not at all realistic of what happens in the real world, because the questions are actually leading the user to an answer. Whereas if you actually just provide a chart or a figure to someone without some sort of a question, they don't necessarily know what they're looking for. And so there's another way to do this called insight-based evaluation, and it was originally developed and talked about in the bioinformatics world by Soraya et al. In 2005. And we sort of adopted this method and tweaked it a little bit for our purposes. And the whole idea behind this methodology is that the principal purpose of some sort of data representation is to elicit insight. That, the data representation then leads to this knowledge or insight. And what is an insight? Well, it's an individual observation about the data by the participant or a unit of discovery. And each insight has characteristics, things like what is the actual observation? How much time did it take to arrive at that observation? Is it correct or not? It might be a great insight, but it might be completely wrong. What value do we assign to that insight? And then does it generate a hypothesis and lead to further questions or not? And so we actually developed 10 different scenarios that we're going to go on and test with this insight-based methodology. And those 10 scenarios we put into two general bins. Either simple charts with 1 to 2 graphical features, moderate charts with 3 to 4, or complex with 5 or more. And we tried to I think we did 4 of these, 3 of these, and 3 of these. And then, we had a whole protocol that we asked caregivers to go through. The first was we used a validated survey instrument called the Graph Literacy Scale, which is basically designed to measure subjects' ability to understand and interpret health-related charts and figures. After that, we then had a training phase where we're able to train people in the idea of thinking aloud as they discover different parts of a visualization, and also train them in how to actually navigate and use the charts and figures because we didn't want the learning curve to affect their ability to actually understand these. And so we did that by talking to them and then also providing them with a sandbox environment to actually go in and explore a little bit. And then we actually did this main insight study where we asked participants to go in and open-endedly explore each of these scenarios. And when they were ready to move on to the next one, they were allowed to. And then we recorded what they said, their audio, their voice, as we did that. And then part of that is we then were able to go in and try and rank the different types of insight. And so this rubric is a combination of a few different things. The first 3 items in our classification came directly from the graph literacy scale. This idea, can you read a value that's directly on the chart? The second is, can you read between the data? Can you identify patterns and trends? Can you read beyond the data? It's the idea of extrapolating beyond data. And then these next 3 we actually incorporated from Soraya's work, where this idea, can you read beyond the specific graph you're looking at, and can you see how that graph ties back to a different graph you've already seen? And then, do the data lead to some sort of hypothesis generation? And then we assigned the highest score to this idea of acting on the data, that the ultimate goal of this app was to call people to action when there was a problem. And so when people identified a problem and said what they were going to do about it, that's when we provided the highest score. After we did that, then you can kind of see back here, we had laminated printouts of each of the representations, each of the graphs, and we just had them sort them out on the table from least useful to most useful, and just kind of get an idea in their head about the utility of each of these charts and figures. And then we had a debriefing interview where we talked to them and said, okay, what would you change? What was confusing? And then if they did miss something, we said, well, look at this right here. How can we help you see that next time? And tried to get even further understanding that way. And then the final step, we had them complete 2 short questionnaires called the Perceived Usefulness and Perceived Ease of Use scales. And the idea is that if we are able to measure their perceived usefulness, then that ties back to our needs assessment that we did up here. That if they find it useful, then we've adequately understood their needs. And if they perceive it to be easy to use, then that ties back to our usability work. That if a high score here helps to suggest that our usability study was able to iron out some of the usability issues. So what did we find out? Well, we purposely selected about 2/3 females versus males. That was, that's how caregivers in general are distributed. And we ended up with a more educated sample than we had hoped for, but we still did get a good range in education level. We were very happy with the age range that we were able to recruit, right around, very similar to caregiver demographics nationally. And then, as some people said, we actually found 3 people that still don't use a smartphone. But that's actually fairly ssimilar to national data as well. So how did we do in terms of graph literacy? Well, the national average is about 9.3, and we came in a little bit high at about 10.7, and that was significantly higher than the national average. And then the perceived ease of use and usefulness scales, we scored 5.8 and 6 on a scale from 1 to 7, and so we felt very good about that. And those scores are actually very favorable when compared to other caregiving tools that have used these same scales to try and measure ease of use and usefulness. And then this is interesting as well, is that there was a significant correlation between people that perceive the tool as useful, and then the insight score that we go on to assign based on the insights that they could elicit from the graphs. So there's a lot of data in this chart, so just kind of take your time to go through it a little bit. So, we had the three different levels of complexity in the graphs, and then if you look for either an asterisk or an S, that's where there's a significant difference amongst the categories. So if you see, in the number of insights, there was a significant difference, both between the simple and the moderate and the simple and complex, between the number of insights that could be elicited, which, might agree with what you would think. But the difference between moderate and complex is actually very small, and was not significantly different. And so then the insight value, we saw a difference between the complex and the simple, but not between the complex and moderate. And then this idea of insight rate, the idea that when you're using a smartphone app, especially, that the amount of insight that you can communicate in the first 30 seconds is critically important. And so we looked at the rate of insight and found that, this is really interesting here, that the moderate graphs were actually outperformed the complex ones, and were significantly different than the simple ones. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. In terms of number of errors, there was a significant difference between those as well, but not in the number of uncorrected errors, which is interesting. And then the other significant difference we found was in the number of calls to action between the three different charts. So, let's explore this a little bit more. So one of the things we can do is we can look at the insights gained over time for the different charts and graphs. And I know you don't know what each of these are, but there are a few I wanted to point out. This one right here, is kind of way below the pack. And people hated that one. Not just in terms of the number of insights, but then in the card sort, it was routinely right at the bottom, had lots of things that people wanted to say about it. And it was interesting to see how that all aligned, that both in our insight evaluation and in our other data we collected, it all matched up. This orange one right here is interesting just because it's so much shorter than the rest. And that's significant because people didn't want to spend as much time looking at that one. The reason why is because some of the data in that chart actually closely mirrored one of the other charts. They were both looking at physical exercise, but from two different measures. And so since people had already seen the one, they didn't feel they needed to explore the second one as much. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was this one up here, that this one's kind of like the gift that keeps on giving, that, when the rest of them started to taper out, it starts to, and then for some reason there was more information to be found in that one. So, if we look at just the three complexity levels, this is what it looks like. And you definitely see this, the low complexity really tapers out sooner than the rest, that the amount of information people can get really diminishes much more quickly. The other two are more similar, but the high complexity, does provide a little more information if you are willing to wait, almost 2 minutes or, a minute 45. Let's look at the first 30 seconds because, that's, so, that's zoomed in, and here's the cleaned up version. So I think this is a really interesting chart because it points out this idea that over the first 30 seconds, the medium complexity may, in general, we don't know, but in our findings at least, may outperform the high complexity. And, what are the reasons for that? Well, we're not sure, but it may be that the cognitive load of a high complexity graph, it actually takes longer to kind of get to grips with. And so, I think this is a really interesting finding that would really be interesting to go in and do some further exploration with. So some of the other things we found, through talking to people and that sort of thing, and then through the card sort, was this idea of the importance of Zoom, that people were very good at finding an issue or eliciting an insight if they were actually willing to go up here and look at the right Zoom level. But the problem was some people skipped right past it and missed it. And so one of the things that I think would really help future system design would be the idea that if we were able to intelligently know which Zoom level to display based on the current data that we're displaying, that would really help users to be able to actually find the issue. We don't need to know what the issue is. We don't need to be able to tell them how to behave or anything else, but we just need to be able to get them to the right screen, basically. And this is a good indication of that. If you look just at the 1 week view, and then you look at the 6-month view, the picture and the conclusions you draw are significantly different between those two. One of the other things, so we purposely designed some incongruence in this visualization, with the top part showing that about 2 of the 4 goals have been met this week. But then if you look down here, they're at 10% of goal completion. One person was able to detect that incongruence. And so we felt that meant that there was a lot of high level of trust in the system. And I think it's really important that as part of that, we maybe have some algorithms or something to check for congruence between especially in the dashboard view where you might be presenting 3 or 4 different charts, to make sure they actually agree with each other, because users were not good at that. So this is the one everyone hated. Maybe you hate it too. But what's interesting was that these non-traditional charts, we had 3 of them. And in general, they actually elicited more and higher quality insights than the more typical line and bar graphs. But it also, we had this polar reaction where most people hated this, and 2 people loved it. 2 people rated it as the highest. And so, the idea here is if you're going to use something that's a little less traditional, you should probably have extra testing to make sure it's as good as you think it is. And eat a piece of humble pie along the way. So what were some of the limitations of this? Well, there was definitely a chance for order bias, in the fact that we didn't randomize the order that the representations were displayed to people. And going along with that, there's maybe a technique learning effect that people got better at the think aloud process as time went on. So we'd really recommend that anyone else who followed this methodology would randomize the order. And our sample is certainly more graphically literate and educated than the general population, which may have influenced their ability to go in and interpret and understand charts and figures. And then, this was our first step to understanding this insight-based methodology. And so we really need further work to go in and validate if we're measuring what we think we're measuring when it comes to insight. And then the idea that our way that we were able to go in and determine graph complexity, looking at graphical features and the number of graphical features, is probably a fairly simplified approach to that. That there's a lot of other things that go into determining how complex a chart or figure is, and we'd love to go in and look at that a little more in detail as well. So if we look at these 3 different steps that we've gone through, how does this contribute to science? Well, it definitely gives us a fuller and better understanding of caregiver needs, and the needs assessment we were able to present at AMIA last year. For the behave section, this idea of operational usability is kind of a a new methodology that we adapted from previous work, and being nimble and being able to do that quickly. And tentatively, that's going to be published in JAMIA soon. And then this idea that we were able to take a relatively new methodology and extend it beyond just being used with scientists. In the past, it was only done with scientists. And to be able to do that with non-scientists and then go in and understand a little bit about how they think I think adds a lot to this process. And then at each step of the way, we've had design implications and lessons learned that really, we believe, will help contribute to this problem of how do we take care of our older adults. In the famous words of Gandhi, a nation's greatness is measured by how it treats its weakest members. And I really believe that this work can help to do that as we work to take care of older adults and help them age in place successfully. And with that, I'd like to, the K is on the wrong line, to thank a lot of people. First and foremost, Holly and Paul, thank you. Thank you for your mentoring, your advice, for genuinely caring. And then the rest of my committee, Paula on the phone, Michelle and Vishnu, thank you for your invaluable expertise, advice, and mentorship. And then, so many people in this room that have been a part of this journey for me. Andrea, Lynn, Diane, I didn't even want to put names up here because I knew I'd forget somebody, but thank you. I really do appreciate it. Of course, I want to acknowledge the NLM training grant that helped to fund this work along the way. And then last, and certainly not least, my wonderful parents and my beautiful wife for putting up with me and the long nights and everything else along the way. And with that, I'd love to hear some of your questions. Oh, and if you do have a question, remember to push the button. Anyone?
I'll ask a question.
Go ahead.
All right, I'll forget. So, no, just hold it down. Yeah, the light doesn't go on. So, lie down back there.
Can you hold the one right behind Paul? Does someone hold that one? Hold it down. Thank you.
That one works. All right. So, simple question. If you had to do this over again,
Mm-hmm.
Is there any major thing you'd do differently looking back?
That's a good question. Very thought-provoking question, too. Yes, there are some things I'd do differently. I think one really simple thing I could have done in the insight study, the final study, would have just been to randomize the order that things were presented. I think that would have been a very simple change that would have helped to eliminate some of the bias in that study. I think another thing I might have done, when you're doing usability testing, there's this trade-off between, do I build a really rich interactive experience, or do I build a much simpler sort of what they call wireframe? And if you provide a rich interactive experience, that's more authentic, but it also, you kind of have to decide on a design direction and decide on things kind of prematurely almost. And so I think it would have been interesting to maybe, as you go through the rounds of usability testing, to become more and more authentic in terms of prototype fidelity as well. And I think that, that would have maybe been a little more work, but I think it would have helped us to not get so solidly in a design direction too soon, if that makes sense. With the needs assessment, I would have loved to talk to a few more people, I think. I think ultimately, what we found out was important, but I'm not sure we reached, saturation, and I think we could have probably found out a little bit more than we did.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Justin.
Thank you. I know technology has been evolving during the process of, as you've been developing this over the last few years, but as we start to look, the smartphones are starting to look small in comparison to the tablets that we start seeing through the room. What do you think the proper medium will be for this?
That's a really good question. And we talked a little bit about that when we talked about the needs assessment, this idea of hybrid usage across the different form factors. I think ultimately the portability and the always connected nature of a smartphone is ideal simply because it provides a good mechanism for alerting when there is a problem. That, if you want to find out if there's a problem, you don't want to wait till you get home that day. But this idea also that, you could alert across different devices, and whatever one you pick up first, the alert is there. And getting away, it's almost like device independence in a way. I think is probably how I see this going. Joe?
If I were to give you a grant for $1 million right now, how would you follow up on this work? What would you do with it? What are the priorities?
I would love to do an intervention study and actually build this thing and see if, one thing we didn't look at was, will people actually use this in the real world? And that's important. There's a lot of applications that get built that might, someone might tinker with it for a few days and then put it down, and after that it's just annoying and they don't touch it again. And I'd love to be able to look at, if we really built this thing with real data about your loved one, number one, do you care? Like, is that something you're going to use? And number two, how does that change the care that you provide? And I'd love to be able to do that if we had the time and money to do it.
Yeah, so actually, maybe you might want to spend some of the money on this too. I was interested in you noted that a limitation was the educational level of people, which is always an issue with, technology. As academics, we tend to develop it and then, test it on people who don't, represent the normal population. How might you sort of delve further into that question, and what might you do to try to accommodate people who at a lower educational level and maybe having more difficulty using it?
So that's a really interesting and important question. I think one way that we could try and address that more is, obviously from a study perspective, being able to sample more people and get at that lower segment a little more. But from an application and design perspective too, this idea that, maybe you could have tailored information based on your ability to understand different types of charts and figures. That, if there was some sort of very quick way of understanding a person's graphical literacy, then you could change the complexity of the graphs accordingly. And I think that would be a great way to do it if you could convince people to take a quick little introduction survey at the beginning or something. Having said that, I don't know if that would offend people or anything else. They don't have to know, but I think it could provide extra value if you took that sort of an approach.
I forgot what you said, the average number of insights you got per graph for the last part. But I was wondering if you had a sense of how many people actually got the insights that they should have gotten, or how many were off. If you could just give a kind of a feel for an overview of what you observed.
Sure. Yeah, so that, it goes kind of back to this one, that as long as people were at the right Zoom level, they, most of these graphs, not all of them, some of them were just boring, but a lot of them had a take-home message. And, that's really important. If you miss the take-home message, it doesn't matter about all the other details you find. And as long as they were at the right kind of Zoom level to see that, they were very good at finding it. Even the people that maybe struggled with some of the exercises often found the take-home message if they were at the right sort of Zoom. I was surprised how big of a factor, just clicking on the different Zoom levels would be. I'd love to hear feedback about ways to help with that. But no, for the most part, people are very good at that kind of take-home message and identifying it.
Another question. So a lot of this hinges on the amount of insight, or the performance in terms of insights. So I'm curious about the value of insights, both in terms of just sort of some insights are more valuable than others, but also negative insights. So if it's boring because no change is needed, does that count as an insight? They say the novice surgeon knows how to operate, and the expert knows when. And so when you do nothing, that sometimes is a really smart choice. Could you
Right.
comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, so if people were willing to state the obvious, we absolutely gave them credit, which, basically means if people said, oh yeah, he's very stable, then yes, that absolutely counted as a valuable insight. But the worry is that sometimes if people see what they consider to be nothing, they won't say it. And that is absolutely a concern of this. When we were doing the training at the beginning of this, we tried to be very clear, though, that to ask them to point out things that were irregular and things that were more normal, and to describe them either way. So.
I had just one more. Sorry. When you were exploring caregiver needs, were there any needs that fell outside the scope of your app?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. We had things like people wanted to be able to track food intake, and so the idea of like a smart refrigerator and a few things. Another person really felt it was important to have like a hobbies section of the app. Yeah, absolutely. There were, but most of the time those things were just mentioned by one person. The one thing that came up quite a few times that we didn't incorporate into the app was being able to share a person's medical record with the caregiver. And as you all know, there are other mechanisms where we're trying to do that too in informatics, but didn't feel we needed to try and tackle that as part of the app. So.
Okay, well, we will dismiss the audience and leave you to your committee. Take it from there. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.